start this conversation by trying to locate the conversation in a way that's relevant to this sector, so international NGOs. And when I read the cause report that JB Weir had done, struck me that a number of things struck me about the sector. It's of the various parts of the voluntary or not-for-profit sector, call it voluntary not-for-profit sector, it's probably the least well-funded, seems to own less property than everybody else, and it's probably more dependent on government funds in some respects than others. I just wanted to start, therefore, by asking John McLeod if he could reflect a bit on the particular challenges for this part of the not-for-profit sector.
Thank you. I guess where I'll start, before you throw things at me, is I actually think it's the most important of the charity sectors. Our own private philanthropy is done predominantly to the not-for-profit sector, so I really value what it's done. And I'm a little bit like a lot of others as to when you line up the things that you do versus arts versus a whole lot of other things, this is the most important cause. So that on the line, I think the problem with the sector is it's got the worst business model of all of the not-for-profit sectors. It relies for its income is about almost 70% over here, and very similar in Australia, is reliant on philanthropy. And the sector average over here is about 14%. So you'd live and die by your philanthropy. And most of that philanthropy comes from the mass market. And as it's been pointed out this morning, the mass market philanthropy has been relatively flat in both countries. In fact, in Australia, mass market philanthropy as a proportion of the population peaked in 1983, and it's been in steady decline. Over here, the numbers aren't dramatically different. So the saturation there, you all fight for the same donors. I imagine some of you may swap lists with other people and things like that. So it's a really tough part of the philanthropy pie. It's not the fastest growing part. The fastest growing part, I don't think this sector and a number of other sectors talks to terribly well, and by that I mean the high net worth and the corporates. So I think the philanthropy part is really tough for you. The other area is, and it's sort of a virtue in that you raise a lot of money from philanthropy and then you spend it all doing really good, worthwhile things, but there's a lousy balance sheet in the sector. You haven't built up the assets that perhaps a lot of other not-for-profit sectors have over many, many years. And I often think it's a bit ironic that the religious sector, which a lot of not-for-profit international NGOs came out of, have got exactly the opposite problem to you. They've got a lot of property. They don't have much in the way of a falling level of philanthropy, and yet some of the history is the same. So I often reflect on the two of those.
Thanks, John. I'm just going to try and get around the panel for a start. Can I ask Chris, as a former... Is Chris here? Yes, thank you. So I haven't met you all before. I'm sorry, I got in here a bit late. It's a former CEO of a traditional NGO with a very large charity. As I read the cause report, probably one of the best funded. What do you see?
I think your lapel works.
Are you sure? Okay.
What I see is disruption coming, and Paul earlier referenced Nokia and also touched on Kodak. When I looked at my organisation, I in many respects felt we were facing a Kodak moment. The problem with Kodak was simply this, is that it believed its own publicity. Secondly, it looked out at the world and thought we're bigger than the change itself, and it never saw the change coming. And in many ways, I think that's the challenges for the big NGOs, whether we're talking World Vision, whether we're talking some of the other big NGOs in this world, is that nobody doubts the cause. It's a fabulous cause that we're involved in. But the danger is we start to believe our own stories of success. And that is the most dangerous thing that can happen to you. So my threat, if I was thinking about it from organisational terms, wasn't from another not-for-profit in the sector. My threat was a 23-year-old with a computer and a really big idea, and I wouldn't see him or her coming. That was the biggest challenge that faced me. So the challenge for us as an organisation was, did we disrupt ourselves? In other words, did we Uber World Vision, or did we allow somebody else to do it to us? Let me tell you, when you decide to do it yourself, it is really, really challenging, because all sorts of power dynamics play up, all sorts of history plays up, and it's a very, very lonely place to be as a senior leadership team. But however, I think that's the journey that each one of us faces here in this room.
But was it the nature of the ask? I mean, one of the things I particularly wanted to ask you about with the World Vision in mind is it the power of the individual, I presume, though, is still a a powerful ask, or has that had its day?
I think it's what's had its day is that we treat individuals all alike. So we expected that all people would basically respond to our letters. And you used to get lots and lots and lots of letters from us, and we expected you to respond in a similar way. What we saw when we started looking at what actually drove our supporters was about 3 or 4 different groups. There was a group of people, smaller than we thought, who loved the idea of child sponsorship, who wanted to have a photograph of a child on their fridge, and that child was a member of their family. We thought that was all New Zealand. The evidence said otherwise. There's another group of people who said, actually, we don't want a child on our fridge. The reason we're doing this is because we want our kids to have a really good understanding of a world out there which is very different to their own. So their motivation was different. Then there's a third group that was turning around and saying, look, I'm just a good corporate citizen. I don't actually much care, but no, I need to do something. Whether it's you or UNICEF or Oxfam, I don't really care, just so long as I do something. And the last group was the group that said, actually, we believe in best practice. We want to support water programs, but we want to know it's the best practice of water programs, so we want to see an evidence of outcomes. Now, the trouble was, we never told them the story about outcomes. We treated them all like they were Princess Diana, and were surprised when they started returning our letters.
Thanks. Can I turn to you, Viv? When I look at UNICEF, particularly if I'm heading down the street and there's a bucket being rattled at me, I think, UN, they've got plenty of money. It's a monolithic brand. What are the challenges that you've faced? And can you talk a little bit about what you've done? I'm particularly interested in the Les Mills example.
I guess the first thing I'd say, is that working? Yes. Is disruption for me doesn't come from anything that we've heard this morning so far. The retrospective data, the shock and horror and fear about change, all of that, to me, in a day-to-day practitioner point of view, is pretty irrelevant. What's relevant is how do we understand our role in international countries, and how do we, in conjunction with our partners, do a better job of getting scalable change. So it's a much more future-focused thing than all this retrospective dread data. So that's the first thing. UNICEF is a kind of arm's-length branch of the UN. It never rattles buckets. And it is unfunded by the UN. So it has a relationship and a mandate from the UN to speak on behalf of children and children's rights globally, but it is not funded by the UN. It is funded and traditionally has been funded by member states of the United Nations. So New Zealand government, for example, has traditionally directly paid to UNICEF New York $6 million a year. And that money traditionally was flexible. Government's contributions were flexible, and it was paid and it was considered to be used for those children most in need around the world. Over time, that's changed dramatically. Now governments want to have a say about where their money is spent and on what, and where not it will be spent. So that's a really important point. So now the flexible funding for UNICEF comes from citizens. And this year, for the first time ever, the 2016 year, there was more money from citizens that was flexible than governments, which is a really important point, because things like equity for girls, equity for children in ethnic minorities come from that flexible funding. So that answers that question. In UNICEF New Zealand, our innovation has been about digital. In my view, the time of enterprise IT systems, where you contract out your IT work to a company, a Fujitsu or a Squiz or whoever supplier you're using, and they work on your behalf, is gone. Too slow, too inflexible, and too expensive. And we've turned around our conversion, and I'm talking fundraising here, from our website from less than 2% to, at particular points in time, over 15% conversion directly on the website by bringing it in-house, having great digital natives running it, by increasingly personalising people's experience on it. So it's still not a huge percentage of our overall income, but it's growing rapidly. The innovation with Les Mills is testing just about every part of my brain at the moment. This is a disruption of UNICEF. We are organised in territories, so I have a mandate to fundraise in New Zealand. But the partnership with Les Mills has kind of turned that on its head. This is a company who mostly exist internationally. We know them as gyms here, but their real product is movement to music that they sell to gym chains internationally, 20,000 gyms and 130,000 licensed instructors. So that network of people are now crowd fundraising for UNICEF New Zealand in that network around the world this weekend. And this morning Orlando Bloom has put out a Instagram saying, support this, it's really important. Pink is about to release the same message in the next few minutes. So I've managed to basically destroy the New Zealand territory that I've got to fundraise in by partnering with a company that represents a sector, the fitness sector. 200 million people go to gyms each week in the world. And so that's suddenly my playing field. And so, you know, right now we've built a crowdfunding platform with a company in Copenhagen. It's collecting money in 30 different currencies through a whole range of different payment gateways. And, you know, we're coordinating and facilitating all that from here. So it's very exciting, very risky. Who knows if it's going to work? But, you know, this year it's the first year of a 3-year contract with Les Mills. It's all about proof of concept and figuring out what works and what doesn't. So, yeah.
Thanks. Can I just ask you one more thing about that? How does the international head office feel about all this?
The international head office loves it, but the other national committees, like New Zealand, like so the Australian National Committee, the German National Committee, they're not so keen because it's requiring us to rethink about how money flows within the organisation and how we count benefit. So, you know, I've just had to have my eye on the what does the best job for children measure. And so if in the end none of that money flows through the New Zealand balance sheet, irrelevant to me, but goes directly to UNICEF, then it'll be a footnote in my accounts, but I don't care. And that will drive a disruption in the way we count contribution. And I'm completely comfortable with that.
What you've raised a little bit, though, is the question of the ability to be flexible, to work quickly and to change the way that you think and work. So I wanted to ask Maria, because it's a while since I last worked in the public sector, but...
Me too.
The meeting culture that Rod Drury described is not the meeting culture that I recall. In fact, it's not the meeting culture that I recall from big corporate life either. Firstly, are government agencies really able to cope with in a disrupted environment themselves? What evidence do you see of attempts to do that?
Firstly, no mai, haere mai, piki mai, kaki mai, kia ora, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for the very kind invitation. Look, the short answer to the question is yes, we can be more nimble. What is focusing my attention is making the citizen, the person, the hero of our story, as opposed to making the agency the hero. And that is actually a fundamental shift, both in the machinery of government, in ministerial portfolios, if you like, in technology choices, in policy. It really fundamentally turns the existing arrangements on their head. The way we operate government in New Zealand is a function of reforms that were undertaken 30 years ago, where it was very much driven out of output and measurable delivery. And that's forced a more product-centric way of operating. And you guys will all know it. We're all citizens. We're all consumers of public services. And my own personal belief is that we exist in the public service to deliver public services. We also exist to serve the government of the day, but they are also in public service. And so part of the disruption, if you like, is some really small things that I've done inside my own organisation and asked of my own team, which is things like, what do you say your occupation is when you arrive back in the country? Do you call yourself an accountant, or do you call yourself a public servant? And my expectation is that the 1,000 people I leave all write public servant on their arrival card, because that actually starts to really hone in on why we're here. Now, the reality of that is if you make the person that we serve, or the whānau that we serve, the hero of our story, then we have to be able to respond in a deeply personal way to the individual circumstance. And therefore we have to be able to move away from delivering and designing services around the majority, which actually just want less friction from the way they access public services. We need to remove the friction, and a lot of that's digital and automation and all of that stuff, to enable our people to much better deal with the more vulnerable, the more acute need, the people who need more assurance from their government that they have a safety net, that they will be supported. And to do that, we actually need to actually equip the people who look into the eyes of those citizens every day, and the counters who are getting paid much less than me. We have to authorise them to make decisions. And that's the big disruption that's occurred, is moving the authority away from people like me and vesting it in the people who are actually dealing with citizens every day. And applying lessons from the consumer world in terms of how to predict and automate and use data and analytics to really understand a person and know them, use those and apply them in very real ways right at the coalface. And that's exactly the investment that we're making now.
It may be unfair to ask you this, it might be more a question for MFAT, but as the funding agency, a major funding agency for international development assistance, how good at that is a government agency likely to be?
Well, all I can do is point you to some examples. Who here has a New Zealand passport? Okay. Who here has done that in an online environment? Who here was pretty surprised by the level of service that you received and the rapidity of it? Come on, more of you have to be pleased. Well, you're actually accessing the only truly end-to-end passport service in the world, and that was developed here by my team in New Zealand. We've also just developed Smart Start, which is the integration of public services that people were accessing around the birth of a child. It occurred to me literally, and I think this is the point, Patrick, that what it takes is just like everyone in this room, is a person or two people or three people to actually grab on to a flag on a hill and say that we're going to take that hill. We're going to, as senior leaders in the public service, we're going to behave in a way that drives this kind of change through the way that we work. And we're going to inspire all the 35,000 public servants to believe in that sense of social purpose. That's actually about behaviour and leadership. It's not really about more money or more people. It's actually about leadership focusing the attention in the right place. And I believe we do have the capability. We've demonstrated it. We're demonstrating it every single day. And in fact, I'm not big noting, and don't treat this as some sort of romantic exercise. I was in Portugal last week at this thing called, just sunning myself, at this thing called the Web Summit. If you haven't heard of it, it's extraordinary. 60,000 participants and 20,000 volunteers, which is startups and major corporations, all talking about disruptive technologies and artificial intelligence and robotics, and it's incredible, it's overwhelming. And you know what was missing in the conversation? No one was there talking about public services. Everyone was there talking about the consumer environment and the business environment. And we're striding through this big hole called public service access. And I absolutely believe that New Zealand is going to own that territory and demonstrate to the world exactly what better access to public services should look like for everyone.
So I'm not sure if this is a question for you or for perhaps other members of the panel who are familiar with the New Zealand policy environment, but in terms of assessing impact, is there anything out of the whole social investment approach which is potentially useful in the NGO sector, in this sector particularly?
Do you want me to have a...
Have you got a view?
Yeah, I do. Look, I think... I wasn't happy about the word feisty, but I'll grab it. Look, I do. Look, I think, you know, one of the things is that in governments all around the world and in the public service environment all around the world, and I haven't spent my career in the public service. I mean, you know, I've spent the last 9 years. I've actually chosen to make this the career of choice. What I've seen in the last 9 years is a really rapid shift away from being purely policy-led, you know, where the brainier people than me would sit and devise wonderful policy options, often based on sort of theory rather than practice. And that would take a long time to go through its various channels, and ministers would talk about things and all of that stuff. And then you'd sort of, at the end of it, some years later, you'd get some legislation. And people like me who are in delivery, kind of service delivery roles, would end up having a few months to actually implement this thing. And the poor old community or citizen or whomever got what popped out the other end. They were policy takers, really, in a sense. We then, I think a few years ago, moved much more into it being a kind of almost a technology-led conversation. And again, you kind of got what, frankly, the enterprise architects decided was the best idea. And again, the people like me got left with, you know, what we had to do, and then the citizen got what some enterprise architect was going to be good. And it's not optimal. What we're really now finding, I think, is that it's actually, we've leapfrogged it being service delivery led, and it's now, I think, much more, and the expectation is legitimate, that it should be citizen led. The social policy stuff, I think, actually has real merit in actually informing the investment pipeline that could be put in place to respond to the changing kind of citizen, community, whānau kind of national dynamics. Anything that's actually based on much better data and analytics and, more importantly, insight has got to be a good thing. But the thing we have to do, and I think this is the challenge for government, is we have to take what happens out of the analytical world. We have to be able to apply it in real time, as opposed to just applying it into a policy process. We have to apply it in real time in the service delivery environment.
I would have thought, sorry, Paul, and I just would observe though that in that equation also, what those measures are needs to be accepted by the agencies which are the recipients of the funding as well. So it's an extra dynamic in the funding of NGOs that if there's not an agreement that some kind of range of metrics is the appropriate range of metrics, then you're going to run into trouble very quickly. And I'd have thought that those metrics are going to change and look different for different types of NGOs.
Yeah, we don't want to overthink that either. You know, frankly, we don't want to overthink metrics, because we'll find ourselves sitting in meeting rooms talking about measures of outcome, and it's notoriously complex. As all of my colleagues here would be able to testify, whichever sector you're in, if you're trying to measure outcome, it's incredibly difficult. You've got to find a simple proxy. You know, you've got to find, even in our case, for example, a simple proxy for whether an integrated service was a good idea was actually around saying, well, what do we know? We know that there's 60,000 births in New Zealand each year. We know that, what else do we know? There's a bunch of things that the child kind of has to do. Usually, you know, they don't tend to do it themselves. The caregiver might not be their biological parent, but their parents also have stuff to do. Let's look at that. Well, what we found was between pregnancy being confirmed and about 9 months of age, there was between 25 and 28 known interactions with public service providers. And we were still treating every birth like it was just the first time it had ever happened, you know. And actually, we knew enough to be able to create an integrated offering around a circumstance. And all we needed to do was say, does the mother and the child and the caregiver have a better experience around this vulnerable period of their life as a result of having Smart Start available to them, or don't they? It's a simple yes or no. And if the answer is yes, then I go, great, tick, let's apply that model of integrating service around circumstance to something else. And we went to end of life, the other end of the continuum, both known, and we're filling in the gaps in between. So we've got to be careful we don't overthink measures either.
Okay. Paul, you had a point to make.
So I was going to come in on this social impact. I'm a social impact investor skeptic on the basis that the transaction costs are very large and the circumstances in which you've got enough evidence and data and other things are quite rare. Not because I'm inherently against the idea. That said, and as you know, it's just been Melbourne Cup week in Australia and Melbourne. The horse called morality doesn't usually fare very well in any race. The nag called self-interest always runs pretty well. Picking up on Viv's point, what I'm really excited about things like social impact or commissioning for results or all those sorts of things is it starts to change the incentives in the system. So in New Zealand, you've got a long way ahead of Australia. You've got less layers of government, and so this sort of integrated service approach makes, can be done. In Australia, we've got multiple levels of government. The incentives of each of the ministers and the public servants and the organisations are all running countering to a good consumer outcome. And what I'm excited about with these new ways of funding non-government organisations, including our own, is that it has an opportunity to realign the incentives in the system that mean that outcomes are more likely to be achieved. And I think if we can get mechanisms to do that, that is a fantastic outcome for our missions. And that's what excites me about it.
Can I just throw in that one as well? I mean, I agree that the costs of impact investments, social entrepreneurs are very high. It's still early days. But some of the bigger picture, if you add up all of the global stock markets and bond markets, so all the financial markets around the world, you get $100 trillion US. Today, a quarter of that is managed with some sort of sustainability overlay. Generally, it's just leave out some bad stuff. But the fastest growing area of it is impact investments. A couple of months ago, I was in Christchurch for the Social Enterprise World Forum. There were 1,600 people here, 70% overseas, a lot of them looking at these sorts of projects that they can develop in the third world countries and others. I was interested, Chris, in your comment about World Vision maybe being worried about the entrepreneur who comes up with a great idea. Maybe you should be excited about that and helping fund them and get them going.
Precisely, I think about that. Absolutely. I think it turns on the question about where is your interest. If your interest lies in your mission, then you will embrace the entrepreneur, because the entrepreneur will show you new ways of seeing the world, and they'll do it a lot faster and a lot more nimbly. They'll take a lot more risk, and they'll probably achieve your end a lot faster than you would. If your self-interest is about your own organisation, then you'll ignore the entrepreneur. And I think the whole conversation around innovation, the conversation around change and how it's so discombobulating, ultimately ends up actually where Paul took us at the end of his conversation. It actually comes to a heart conversation. So the change is happening, whether we like it or not. The question is, how willing are we to embrace that change? And for all of us in this room, we are leaders of our organisations. And if we choose to embrace that change, that means we're going to challenge our own organisations to do things differently, to partner with different people, to see the world in very different ways. That requires two things: to keep the mission always at the forefront, because the mission is not negotiable. That's the one thing, and probably the only thing that doesn't change. The question of how we go about doing it, who we do it with, and where we do it is the question for change. And that change can happen externally, and if that happens, we'll be Ubered. Or if we're actually willing to embrace the change, either as a sector or as leaders of our own organisations, then it's just possible we will become that entrepreneur in our own organisations. I think we've just seen a nice example of that from Viv with the partnership.
Can I just go to Jacqueline, look, let me blunder my way through this question. It seems to me you've got a foot in both camps. You work for VSA, which is largely government funded, and from what I know of it has probably struggled and maybe should never have tried to raise funds from the public. On the other hand, you've also created your own social enterprises. What that leads me to think is that you must have some reflections on the importance of the quality of people. And the thing that strikes me about partly what Rod Drury was saying was that if all businesses are going to become purpose-driven rather than profit-driven, and I put a big question mark over that myself. I'm a bit of a sceptic in that area. Is that a good or a bad thing for the not-for-profit sector, in the sense that, on the one hand, you would say that should make working in this sector highly attractive to the, to the purpose-driven millennial, but it also means there's going to be much more competition for those purpose-driven people?
Thanks, Patrick. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. You've asked so many questions in one. and I'm desperate to answer all of them, although I've almost forgotten what the first one was now.
Sorry.
But just what I've been hearing from the panel is there's a lot of focus on the lack of funding. There's a lot of focus on how do we respond to that. And there's a lot of focus on disruption. And what I see is that disruption doesn't have to be about the internal measures within the organisation. I agree with Maria and Viv in terms of it needs to be about the people who we serve. So it's about how do we better deliver what it is our mission is in terms of benefiting our beneficiaries. So when you come at it with that lens, so let's think about the disruption not being around how we fundraise or who we fundraise to or how much money we've got. What about getting a better bang for our buck in terms of the money that we've got now? Because money isn't going to stop being tight. We're always going to have that problem in this sector, especially now and as the change speeds up. So we've got that problem, so how do we deal with it? We've got our mission, so we know what we're doing for our beneficiaries, we know what our focus is, we know why we exist and why we're actually in business. And so how are we going to actually do what we do better with the money we've got? So for me, it was about saying I've got a passion for anti-slavery and anti-sex trafficking, and I was speaking to a very wise mentor of mine who came out of the UN system and isn't there now. But I said to him, look, we've got to solve this problem. This is a real problem for us. And I came at it with, Chris will know this, I've worked with Chris in a past life, and he knows that I come at things with conceptual models. And I came up with all these answers of how I thought we could address this the problem of slavery and sex trafficking. And he said, no, Jack, you're doing this all wrong. You're actually, you'll never solve the problem. And I said, well, I know that, and I'm not that naive. And he said, no, all you can do is you can look at what skills you've got and look at how you're going to chip away at the problem, because that's the most any of us can do, is bring our skills to work and chip away at the problem collectively or individually. And I thought about it, and he said, for example, you'd be good at social enterprise. You've got a private sector, a public sector, and a non-profit sector background. So I thought, oh, I'll be good at this. So I went away and did a lot of research on social enterprise and developed a methodology. Now, the reason I'm telling that story is because it's not one thing or the other. So when we talk about social enterprise, there's a whole continuum of different what we mean by social enterprise. If I ask everyone in the room now, what do you mean by social enterprise, we will come up with a different answer. There'll probably be about 10 or 12 answers or groups of answers. And really, at one end of the continuum, you've got this tension between economic sustainability and social sustainability. And at the bottom, you've got ethical capital. So at the one end of the continuum, of the ethical capital scale, if you like to call it that, we've got non-profits, the traditional non-profits, so we can feel really good about that. And then at the other end of the continuum, you've got the for-profits. And anywhere along that continuum, you've got different ranges of ethical capital. That's how it's described by Bull in 2008. And what it could be like your corporate with a corporate social responsibility. It can be a socially driven corporate. It can be an NGO that's delving into market trading. It can be an NGO with income generating activities, or it can be a social enterprise. So when we talk about social enterprise, I urge you, whenever you're having a discussion about social enterprise, ask the person you're talking to, what's your understanding of social enterprise? What are you talking about? Because otherwise you can be on completely different planets. and think you're having one conversation, whereas you're actually administering two conversations. So first of all, it's important to understand what you mean by social enterprise. Then the way where I sit on the ethical capital scale is right down with the non-profits. So the way I like to apply social enterprise is by one, assisting non-profits to develop funding streams, and secondly, to assist non-profits to help their communities empower themselves and actually be able to derive their own social change. So the sort of changes I've seen out of social enterprises, the money's actually not that important. And one of the first questions whenever I'm working with an organisation and I'm saying, okay, so we know what you want to do with your social enterprise, but then I say, why are we doing this? Is it for financial gain or is it for social change? And normally they say, oh it's about both. I said, great, that's fantastic. Now, if we're really pushed, what is it? 50-50, 60-40, 70-30? And I make them actually think through where the focus of that is. And that's important because that sets up their whole decision-making framework further down the line. So it's really important to do that. But I'm going on. I know I'm going on. I'm sorry. But I'm so passionate about this. But essentially, I think suffice to say that I've seen, in my time, I've seen a lot of development projects, as I'm sure a lot of people here have and a lot of people on the panel. But I can put my hand on my heart and say I've never seen social change happen so quickly and with so much impact as I have when social enterprise is involved. So for me, it's about combining the NGO and the social enterprise opportunity. It's not one or the other, it's both. I hope that explains it, Patrick.
So did you want to come in earlier?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think that one of the things we could be thinking a lot more about is relevance and new sources of information. In the opening speech this morning, I was writing down some names of people who weren't quoted but could have been. One is Paul Hawken, who wrote a book called Blessed Unrest and most recently launched a huge piece of research on what would be the 20 top things to turn around global warming. And number 5 is educate girls, and number 6 is family planning. And if you combine number 5 and number 6, you get the most effective strategy for global warming of any other. And yet, who of us would know that? And who of us would be telling our story about our work through that lens? So I just think there is so much information that helps us see things differently and helps other people see things differently. And you know, I find that a very powerful paradigm shift that we could all stand to find information and points of view different from what we would traditionally do. So I knew you'd love that story. So yeah. So that was my point really. I think that as well as data, which is really important, and you know, my UNICEF is run on an hour-to-hour basis on data, what's working, what's not. There's also story and sources of information and broader meaning. And that is as rich and as important.
Well, what it seems to me you're talking about is disruption of the way that the work of not-for-profit sector agencies is framed.
Yeah.
So one of my questions was, do we need to tell different stories? Are there causes that are going unarticulated?
Totally. And actually, you know, I've moved past ideas of not-for-profit and non-government organisations, and traditionally we've registered in order to attract charitable dollars, the charitable dollars and a non-tax status. But actually a huge amount of social disruption now is coming from self-organising movements, and we shouldn't miss that. And indeed, right now, anyone here from New Zealand needs to be recognising and celebrating the self-organising movement that delivered in the election the key issue being inequality.
and the sense of hope that there is, that we can now have a real conversation about that in New Zealand. And, you know, there were many registered NGOs involved in that movement, but there were as many social movements that had nothing to do with any registration. And, you know, there was a whole Māori iwi leaders path, there was a whole faith community path, there was a whole individuals with inspiration in their communities path, people who, then the election path, and all these things wove together to create a situation where no political party it could not have a view on this in this election. And you know, my recall is it took us 18 years to organise that. And Paul Hawken would say in Blessed Unrest, there is more self-organising, unregistered citizenship movements in the world now than there are terrorists. And yet we don't talk about them, we don't celebrate them. And I think what we need to do right now as in New Zealand citizenship is step back and say what worked. What were the things that finished up with that happening in this election? And how do we do it again? And of course, how do we now make the most of it and hold the government to account for saying what they said they would do? So I feel extremely hopeful about citizenship. There's never been more engagement. It might not be through NGOs. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that a decline in NGOs says anything about commitment or passion or civil society. I don't think it does.
Can I just go back to this question, though, and it was sparked to me by the comment on the cause report about people in this sector being reimbursed rather than rewarded for their work. Now, that's maybe an overly financial way of thinking about the work, but on the other hand, I also see a lot of debate and desire for a combination of more corporate engagement and corporate funding, and the kind of energy and sort of mad arm waving that you get out of a Rod Drury is quite difficult to find very often in this sector. How do you draw those kinds of people in? How do you have any, throwing this out into the panel, what thoughts do you have about the development of this sector as a viable career path for people? And I
thought I was doing quite a good job of arm waving.
Well, it clearly is a viable career path because many of us are doing it. Are people paid well enough? Well, in terms of the average salary in New Zealand, very well. In terms of what people earn in corporates and senior roles, not well. So it's what you're measuring and observing devices. And, you know, that many of my colleagues will say to me that the privilege of working in developing countries and walking alongside people who are making incredible changes, huge decisions in their lives, is where the wealth resides. Now, I wouldn't trade that for a moment for another 100 grand.
Paul?
So I probably take a contrary view. I think as a sector, I think we've done a really poor job of growing our people. So a few years ago I went through all of the big international NGOs' annual reports and looked at how much they focused in on their people. And they all had these wonderful statements, mine included, about how our people are our greatest asset. And then I went in and met with their head of HR and their CEOs and others and started to ask them basic questions about the systems that they've got to make sure that their people, you know, they know where their people are, what they're capable of, you know, what their recent professional development was. And even the biggest said, oh, we don't have anything like that. And then I said, well, what about, you know, professional development? What's your investment? What's your approach? Well, look, it's a really tight funding environment. Quite honestly, that gets cut. And on it, the questions went. And you said, well, hang on, you've got this rhetoric, and then you've got your practice. And so for me, that was a really big warning sign to say when you've got your strategic environment changing in the way that it is, and you have so underinvested in your people and growing in the capability of your people, yet you're asking them to do an increasingly complex thing, that is, you know, a more diverse funding base, more complex political environment in which to operate, all of those sorts of things, is it any wonder that you are less fit for purpose than ever before? So I think we've got to take this challenge seriously. I said in my remarks earlier, I think attracting and retaining and training the very best people is our #1 strategic priority as leaders in this sector, and we've got to start to take that seriously.
I'm just going to extend that one little bit further with volunteers as well. Not many people realise, but the value of volunteering to the whole charity sector, and this sector, is double the value of philanthropy. And so the average age of volunteering workforce in Australia is about 70. We run a risk of losing something that's worth twice as much as philanthropy, and I don't think we're putting those same efforts into that either.
Chris?
The challenge for this conversation is we can think the villain is outside of the room. I think the villain on this one is in this room. How many of us in our annual reports trumpet the fact of how much money goes overseas in our organisation? We do at World Vision. It was 81 cents in the dollar went overseas. We slapped it up there. We didn't quite go to the next step and say which is more than NGO number A or NGO number B. But that's the whole methodology that we run. And that's a methodology which says our real performance measure is how much money do we get out of the door. If we run that methodology, by definition, an organisation that gets 80 cents out of the door will be worse than an organisation that gets 90 cents out of the door. And the organisation that gets 100 cents out of the door, it has to be the best. How did they do it? They hired a plane, they dropped money over Africa. The point is, the reason that we've bought into that argument is because we didn't complete the sentence. We didn't have a conversation about the outcomes, long-term, that we're achieving in the communities. So we default to performance metric. That's our fault. That's not their fault, and that's why we have so many malnourished NGOs in this room.
Sorry, can I go back to Jackie?
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with you, Chris. Just going back to the volunteering, I know that at VSA we couldn't do the work we do without the brilliant volunteers we've got. And I think, you know, every volunteer that we have, very rarely do we get it wrong in terms of the quality of volunteers. And we really, I mean, seriously, all of the impact and the outcomes that we achieve is really due to the volunteers' efforts. So I'd just like to acknowledge them as well.
So I should actually declare also that also part of the area that I lead at the Department of Internal Affairs is also the Charity Services area and our Community Operations area. So you'll be very familiar. But here's a couple of facts that I would say from kind of sitting on the margins of the sector is certainly playing in my mind at the moment, and in discussions with our new minister. There's 28,000 registered charities in New Zealand, and 30% of those have an annual turnover of under $10,000 a year. They go through the same compliance regimes and everything else as large organisations, and you guys are familiar with this. We're also distributing through the Lotteries Grants Board, which again is part of the organisation that I lead, around about $240 million a year through the community organisations and funding groups. Now, the question in my mind, which is a disruptive question, to come back to the theme, is actually what is a sustainable kind of sector in New Zealand in terms of the number of participants that are actually competing for the same resource, whether it's volunteers or whether it's for donations or whether it's investors. I do have a question in my mind about the viability of a sector that is crammed with goodwill and good intention, but competing in a relatively small market of people and money. And I say this kindly. I don't say this to criticise. I say it because from where I sit, what I see is, and I can't remember the numbers, but let's say there's something like 34 individual charities that are, in fact, I think this is the actual number. There's 34 individually registered charities that centre on child cancer. So when you start to think about the problem to solve, whether it's developing people, attracting volunteers, reducing the average age of volunteers and all that stuff, I think in part the structures within the sectors actually become part of that equation. And the need for collaboration and joining and merging possibly as opportunities to actually, I guess, attract more of what the target is might actually be vastly improved.
Certainly, as a small business owner, I would have thought that most of those 28,000 would fail quickly. I suspect in this sector they hang on somehow or other, probably by not paying themselves.
Oh, I think so. I mean, enormous. You know, what we see, and you guys have to produce annual reports and meet, you know, reporting standards and what have you. If you are, you know, if in terms of this that crossover between NGOs and registered charities in New Zealand, yeah, I think there is a lot of hand to mouth in the sector. And you know, the compliance burden doesn't help that, but it's not the problem. It's actually, you know, it just is that there's an enormous spread and I guess just sheer volume of organisations that are actually incurring that cost and off a very small base. And you know, we talked about getting scale earlier, and I think this is one of the areas perhaps in this sector where it might be quite disruptive to look at pursuing a greater scale in some areas in terms of then having the leverage to get to the outcome.
Can I throw this open to the floor? Do we have questions on the floor?
Well, yes, I find this. I was on the Charities Commission when it started up, and we looked at those sorts of issues. And one of the things about charities are they're part of our democracy.
That's right.
Anybody can do it if they want. And sometimes organisations, and I've seen many small international development organisations do enormous amounts of work in a very small area because of the dedication and commitment of the people that were involved, voluntarily and still doing a good job. And I think that the idea that we should try to make everybody scale up is actually one of the real fallacies in all this discussion. Because we need people that are competent at what they do, but we also need people that are doing it because of their heart. And that's where this is where this sector got its social entrepreneurialism in the first place, was that whole starting up of people doing things because they saw a problem and they wanted to address it, and never mind about where they got the money, they just got on with the job. And we've lost that. And I'd like to say that I don't think any of the participants have really addressed the fact that this sector has been disrupted for the past 30 years by government changing the way in which it dealt with the way that funding went in the sector, and they've had to turn themselves into a different sector than they were before. So they're already in the process of disruption, and I'm a bit worried that this is just another step along that same route. So I'd just like to put that one.
The disruptive question from that, though, might be, yes, certainly there will be times when small groups of underfunded people do great work. What if they actually work together? I've spent enough time in this sector to know that there's a tendency to fiefdom as well. So how do you get around that?
Maybe this question goes to Paul. We've talked a little bit about, I guess, new business development models a little bit, and touched on a few things, and you hinted earlier maybe about mergers and so on. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. What are some of the key, shall we say, business development models that you see that are sort of working for different NGOs in the region? Perhaps things that we have not tried before. Perhaps we don't have a lot of evidence that they work, but we have some hints that they might work.
Yep. So I'll try and provide a short answer to a pretty complex question. And build on what Viv and others have said about social enterprises as well. So first of all, I would change the language. I hate the language too of non-government and not-for-profit and all of that sort of stuff. Let's call ourselves mission-driven as opposed to profit-driven organisations. And the organisational forms that we use to achieve our mission will be different, and actually will be different in the one organisation. So in my organisation, you know, say the Children's obviously a sort of classic not-for-profit. We've got new social enterprises, and we've got for-profit entities, legal forms within that one group for different purposes. We've done 3 mergers where that's made sense, but we've also outsourced or providing outsourced services to other not-for-profits where it actually doesn't make sense to merge with them, but actually we've got a platform that will make them more efficient and effective and that they couldn't otherwise afford. That's a great... So WaterAid, for example, in PNG, co-locates with Save the Children and uses all of the Save the Children back offices, for example. In Melbourne, we took a larger building than what we actually ourselves needed, and we've co-located about 4 different charities on our top level, given them the best views, where they've been aligned with our mission, and they actually make us more effective, but it wouldn't make sense to merge with them. One's a youth, orientated campaigning organisation. If we merged with them, it would be their death. It'd be the worst possible thing that we could do. So we've got to look for these different pieces. But what I'm saying, and I'm not here saying that big is always better. There's a lot of the innovation is happening in the small. But
you're really talking cluster theory.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of it is. But my challenge is to focus in on the mission and what is the best thing to achieve the impact that you're trying to achieve at the current time. Those 3 mergers that we've done have been enormously, well, they've released enormous impact. One, Good Beginnings, was an Australian-focused organisation. Not only have we made them much more efficient, and I don't think that they were sustainable, we've increased their effectiveness by a long way. We've started to give their people career opportunities they wouldn't have ever had, all of those sorts of things. Hands-on Learning was a small start-up innovative organisation that came to us and said, we've got this great idea, we don't want to replicate all of the platform that you've got around the whole of Australia, but look at what we can achieve. And we've gone, yeah, you're right. We're going to keep you pretty much actually as you are, but we're just going to really bring all of our capabilities to the table and see if we can take you from about 70 schools to about 400 schools in a quick time that you couldn't otherwise do. So it's that sort of, I think, thinking that is we need to challenge ourselves. And there's no one right answer in all of that.
Thanks. Look, I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm sorry, just to try to keep us to time. I don't think we've necessarily solved the problems of the world. The one thing that stuck with me is the comment that Maria made, which is the value of simple proxies. Try and find things which are the big idea and drive towards them is incredibly important when you're trying to create impact, I think. That can be disruptive when you've got a flow chart and a set of objectives which are too complicated to understand.
Let's give Patrick and the panel a very